Well, so that's an area where he gets a good grade as far as outside observers. One area where he doesn't have a good grade, perhaps, is women. And in your biographical sketch in this, you talk about him as the first pope who's ever worked for a woman, which, you know, most popes, their context for women is their mother, their grandmother. And this guy's worked with women as equals, as superiors. He has friendships, and that's unusual and kind of new for popes who are often raised and lived their lives in cloistered male-only environments.
Yeah, not only a woman, but a communist woman. This was a chapter of the Pope's early days, basically what we would call the period what we would call grad school, basically, where he was training to be a chemist at that stage of his life. So he was working in a chemical lab. Basically, it was an agricultural lab that ran chemical tests on food products. And his supervisor was a communist woman who he has repeatedly described as one of the major influences on his life. I mean, you know, remember when Rush Limbaugh beat up on him for being too critical of capitalism and called him a Marxist?
Right.
And he said, well, it's not true, but I'm not offended because I've known some good Marxists. Well, this is one of the people he was thinking.
Right.
Okay. But what he always talks about is how what she really taught him was a work ethic. You know, he'll tell these stories about how he would perform a test that he was pretty sure you know, it answered all the questions that anyone could possibly ask about a particular product. And, you know, and she would come back and say, well, did you run this test or did you run that test? And he said, well, I don't really think it's necessary. It's like, well, it doesn't matter whether it's necessary. And the question is, could we learn something from it? You know, and so some, I think, of his perspicacity in some ways dates from that experience. So yeah, this is a pope who is very comfortable in the company of forceful, educated, sophisticated, professional women, both in religious life, that is, nuns, and also lay women. Now, you know, that said, I take on board that he gets a kind of mixed verdict on his record on women, because that comfort level to date has been matched by some very promising rhetoric. That is, he's talked about how he wants to see greater roles for women, including a greater presence at the levels at which decisions are made in the church. He's talked about a deeper theology of women. But when you get to the point of asking, what does that actually mean in practice, it gets a little fuzzy.
Right, and the things, and some other things he said, some of his famous off-the-cuff comments have gotten him in trouble, which raises the question of whether he's a liberal. And of course, when Americans think of liberals, they think of women priests and contraception in the context of marriage, and priests being able to marry again like they did for most of the church history. And as you point out in your book, if you're talking about bishops and cardinals and the Pope, there are no liberals in the sense that Americans think it. There's nobody out there calling for women to be priests or priests to get married.
Among the bishops. Now, there certainly are people at the grassroots who would be making that argument.
Like me, of course. Yeah. But so, I mean, when you talk about is he liberal, is he conservative, well, you know, every pope is liberal when it comes to social justice and the ills of capitalism. John Paul II, who's seen as very conservative, of course, decried the
I used to say about John Paul that on social justice issues, he was too liberal not only to get nominated by the Republicans in the States, he could not have gotten nominated by the Democrats right. because he would be seen as too liberal.
Maybe in Vermont. He could have been a senator in Vermont.
Yeah.
So, I mean, when you talk about this Pope and his attitude towards women and what changes might come, you have to really be modest in your expectations.
Well, I mean, listen, let's be clear. You know, we've asked him, that is, the press corps twice has asked him the women priest question, and both times he's given us a flat no.
Right.
Okay, so that's not in the cards. We've asked him, what about women cardinals? Answer has been no. You know, what about appointing a woman to run a Vatican department? Answer, it depends on which one, but some of them have to be headed by cardinals. Listen, I think part of this is that Pope Francis, ironically enough, for being a guy who is now at the absolute pinnacle of the clerical food chain, is in some ways remarkably anti-clerical. He doesn't like the whole clerical system. And therefore, he abhors the idea that the only way to be important or of value in the Catholic Church is to be a cleric. Okay, so he doesn't want to, what he always says is, I don't want to clericalize women. So he's looking for some non-clerical way to sort of boost their role. And it's you know, I mean, it's a fascinating project. It's just, I think this is one of those cases with Francis where there are times he will start a conversation because he knows absolutely and precisely where he wants it to end. And there are other times where he has a gut-level instinct that something is important, but he's not really sure what the end game looks like. And I think the conversation about women in the church is an example of the latter.
Yeah, I mean, when you talk about people empowering the curia or in the bureaucracy, lay people in general, not just women, have trouble because if they sign off on a document, it may not even have any power or effect because they are not members of the clergy.
Well, now we're drilling down into inside baseball, but that's true of some departments and not others. But on the other hand, I mean, let me give you a couple of examples. I mean, Joaquin Navarro Valls was John Paul, who's a Spanish layman, was John Paul's right-hand man for most of his papacy. He was his spokesperson, but he was much more than his spokesperson. I mean, he was his key advisor on Latin America. I mean, when John Paul was in negotiations to take a trip to Cuba, Navarro was the guy he dispatched. I mean, Navarro was part of John. There were 2 or 3 people who were John Paul's sort of core kitchen cabinet with whom he would not make an important decision without discussing it with them. Okay, and Navarro was in that circle. Okay, and that was not a priest, not a cleric, not a religious. I mean, that was a lay man who was, I think, by almost universal consensus, one of the 2 or 3 most powerful people in the Vatican. So it's not to say that this can't be done. It's just to say that if you want to see women playing roles like that, you have to be intentional about creating them. And so far, what we've seen is the rhetorical commitment. We have not seen the intentional follow-through.
But in general, if you want women to have a role in the church, to start off by saying, but you can't have any positions of power because power is ugly anyway. Who wants to be like us powerful men? It's a no-starter. I mean, if you cannot have an active and equal role in the church, you're never going to have an active and equal voice.
Well,
you're never going to be.
Listen, I mean, there are some people who are just never going to be able to get past the bar on women priests, who are just going to see that as a fundamental injustice, a matter of gender inequity that's a kind of anachronism. And therefore, no solution short of breaking that barrier is ever going to satisfy them. And I understand the logic, and I understand the passion that surrounds that. That said, okay, I don't get paid to live at the level of ought. I get paid to live at the level of is. Okay, and at the level of is, the short-term political reality is women priests aren't happening. And so, therefore, I think what you're going to get, I think what you have actually, is this kind of moderate clump in the church that whatever they privately think about the desirability of women priests, realize it's not feasible in the short term. But at the same time, they realize the church looks like a boys' club a lot of the time. Okay, it's got a women's problem.
It is a boys' club.
Well, listen, I mean, I've covered papal liturgies, okay, and once you get past the rows of cardinals and archbishops and bishops and monsignori and so on, I mean, you're in the cheap seats before you even run into a woman. Okay, I get it. Okay, but that said, I think that moderate sort of cohort is going to say, look, let's focus on what's achievable. Okay, and what's achievable in the here and now is, the Pope has said he wants to see greater, meaningful leadership roles for women. Let's start talking about what they would look like, and let's put them on the table.